Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Stéphanie Leyronas, and I'm the focal point on commons, issues, and research activities at AFD. And I'm very, very pleased to animate this session. So you saw on the program that the title of the session is Ecological Planning. Actually, the purpose of this session is to make the first links between the concept of strong sustainability and the production of knowledge on one hand, and decision-making and policy action on the other end. So there will be three very interesting papers that will be presented. The first paper will be presented by Clément Ferger. Thank you very much. This paper focuses on ecological accounting methods at different levels of decision and organization. It addresses the conditions under which this knowledge can support or not decision-making in a strong sustainability perspective. The second paper will be presented by Johanna Barasz. This paper proposes to mobilize the concept of sustainabilities, no, not strong sustainability, but sustainabilities, and to use this concept as a public action framework in France, including new narratives, tools, methods, production of knowledge, and operational process, like a big program. And the last paper will be presented by Eric Kemp-Benedict. Thank you for being here. The entry point of this paper is the property regimes. It critiques the usual approach of the property rights that underpin decision-making, and it proposes, in contrast, a way to specify duties towards ecosystems. Is that correct? Great. So the way this session will be organized is the following. So each speaker will have 20 minutes, and we will not take any question between presentations, so please pay very close attention at this beginning of the afternoon to the three presentations, and keep in mind your best questions for the end of the session. And hopefully we will be able to dedicate 20 to 25 minutes for questions from the room and from the chat. And we will really do our best to take as many questions as we can. So I'm first inviting Clément for his speech. So Clément Ferger is currently assistant professor at AgroParisTech. He carries his research at the University of Montpellier, and he is scientific manager of the ecosystems axis within the Ecological Accounting chair, and he co-directs the Economy and Society Department of the Collège des Bernardins. So Clément, the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stéphanie. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here in this room and online. I'm very pleased to be here to present this paper. Just to put it back in context, this paper has been produced as an input paper originally to an expertise process that was led by the NGFS Inspire group on biodiversity and financial stability. And it was the opportunity for the two co-authors, Harold Levrel, Alexandre Rambaud, and myself, to actually put forward the three ecological accounting methods that we are currently working on within the framework of the Ecological Accounting chair. I will say a word about the Ecological Accounting chair. And Harold Levrel, Alexandre Rambaud, and myself are scientific co-director of the Ecological Accounting chair, and so I'm also presenting partly their work in the context of this presentation. So a word about the Ecological Accounting chair. It's a chair that is hosted by the Fondation AgroParisTech Foundation, and that is a partnership between different universities, AgroParisTech, Paris Dauphine University, Reims-Champagne-Ardennes University, Institut Louis Bachelier, and also businesses who fund the share, and the Ministry of Ecological Transition and other actors who participate into this initiative. And basically, the main work that we do is also PhD and postdoctoral work. We work on the three methods that I will now present. So the starting point of this presentation is to observe that since 2005, and more particularly within the 2010s, there is a multiplication of approaches that have taken as a main objective to measure impact and dependencies on different organizations and biodiversity, and alerting on the risk of biodiversity loss. So it does that, the interdependencies with the economy, with society at large, also between biodiversity and financial stability, by way of both biophysical modeling, and we've seen some examples this morning, and economic monetary valuation approaches of ecosystem services and so on. So these approaches have played an important role in the past years in some ways in making the value of protecting ecosystems and nature's contribution to people more visible, in developing more another kind of argument for nature protection, and to advocate for more decision and action based on those figures. However, and it has been also recalled this morning by Antonin Potier, there are a lot of limitations to these kind of approaches when it comes to actual decision-making, organization of action, processes of organizing action in multiple contexts. And this has been proven by several empirical studies, such as Requero Vito, who has studied how economic accounts are actually not so much used for decision-making in actual decision-making context. So the issue this paper addresses is to recognize the importance of such measurement methods, the assessment of benefits and risk. However, to say that if we want to actually transform our economy into a system that actually preserves biodiversity, there is a need to go one step further in integrating biodiversity-related information at the heart of organizational processes and decision-making procedures at different levels. And what we argue is that such endeavor relates to a specific discipline, to a specific domain of knowledge, which is accounting, and more specifically, ecological accounting. So the issue here is what kind, the issue that the paper addresses is what kind of ecological accounting concepts and methods can be easily implemented and scientifically sound to support the management of biodiversity-related risks and reorganize our economic system towards the achievement of biodiversity conservation goals. So it's a long sentence, but that's the issue that we try to address in this paper. As I said, we're working on three different levels. I will come back to that, but before, I would like to explain the three shared foundations on which the three different methods at the three different levels work on. The first shared foundation is going a little bit deeper about what we mean by accounting and how is it different, for instance, from economics or from biophysical modeling. The accounting as a field of study, first of all, accounting is the fundamental language of all organization, and beyond its ability to be a calculative practice, just like economics or biophysical modeling, it is a calculative practice that is specifically tailored and designed to be a basis for dialogue, for negotiation, for decision-making, for planning, for adjudicating, for justifying, for controlling. So a lot of actually social and organizational practices. The second point is that accounting as a field of study and of knowledge invites us to recenter our analytical lens on methods for organizing what Roberts and Scappens called systems of accountability. So how to negotiate, enforce commitments among different organizations or within an organization. So how to enforce accountabilities. Third point about accounting is that it focuses on the detailed, accounting studies focus on the detailed use of multiple types of accounts, very large definition of accounts in complex and contextualized decision-making settings. So context is very important in accounting studies. Another point is, in accounting studies, it's very important to recognize the political nature of choosing and using a different set of accounting frameworks, conventions, and norms over others, and their underlying worldviews. So basically, by essence, accounting is a subjective issue and not... So, of course, it objectifies things, but it is subjective in the sense that it is always a set of conventions that are being chosen among humans to categorize things, to decide how to count things, etc. So there is a need to also understand that it always rests on a certain worldview that needs to be as explicit as possible, to be as debatable as possible. And also, as compared to statistical approaches or these types of approaches, there is a focus here on, first of all, accounting is inventory and counting things as they develop, and inventorying things as they appear. So there is a focus on that, and there is a focus also on counting costs of actions rather than the economic value of something. And this will be very important for the things that I will develop just after that. So the idea, well, that's too fast. The idea was to say that, so also just to point out that there is a whole field of studies since the 90s that is called ecological accounting, which is a field of critical studies in management studies that has taken a lot of time to question and critique adverse effects of existing forms of accounting systems and practices at different levels. So it has unveiled the adverse effects on the environment of the existing kind of accounting that we use on a daily basis. And it also organized an academic discussion about how to integrate the values of nature, values, we'll come back to that, in the heart of accounting systems and so on in the heart of organizational procedures, practices, etc. The second shared foundation is, and I won't develop so much this one because it's been discussed a lot in this conference, but it's as accounting rests on a specific worldview. The methods that we work on we try to make as explicit as possible that we work on a strong sustainability worldview and perspective. So it means that we focus on the measurement of progress towards ecological performances goals that are the object of both scientific assessment and collective conventions among humans, so political targets or normative targets. Nature goals that are recognized as relevant to preserve the renewability of ecosystems within certain boundaries. And so in the three methods, we conceive nature as a debt that is being valued at the costs of actions needed to maintain it. And this point will become clearer in the three methods. So we are in a cost-based approach rather than economic valuation approach. I've already mentioned that. And the third shared foundation is that we work on these three different kinds of perimeters that we want to interlink, and that's a lot of the work of the PhD students we work on this interlinkage. So these three different levels are the state, businesses, and ad hoc context of ecosystem management on the landscapes. And we develop methods at these three different levels. And at these three different levels, we both do a critical work to inquire about the existing kind of accounting, but also we propose different methods and we test them to give leverage to different kind of actors whose transformative actions are, of course, complementary. So governments and public authorities, managers within businesses, and local stakeholders and citizens at the ecosystem management scale. So now about these three different methods, I will start with the national level, national perimeter, and the work that we undertake in the ecological accounting chair about this. So basically, this is mostly the work led by Harold Levrel, and also by the PhD students that we supervise, Clément Ferger. But the way we deal with the question of national accounting in the view that I just mentioned is based on the work of Vanoli, André Vanoli, who recently, unfortunately, left us, was developed throughout the 1990s and the 2000s what he called unpaid ecological cost methods. Basically, the concept is that you treat nature as a distinct entity within the national accounting framework. So in the national accounting framework, you have different institutional sectors that are being represented. You have financial societies, non-financial society, administration, households, etc. The idea is to say there is another one, which is nature, and the other institutional sectors are in debt towards nature when they use nature in a way that degrades it. And so we test on methods that allow both on a biophysical basis to assess this depth in terms of degradation of different ecosystem components, and at the same time to assess the unpaid ecological cost, which means the costs that the other institutional sectors, or if we decide this cost to be socialized through taxes or other things, but we try to assess the costs that these other institutional sectors should pay to restore nature to its original state. This gives an idea of the financial needs for preserving, restoring the environment on a national basis. And this also qualifies, of course, national welfare measurement. And it is a basis for discussion. We hope it could become a basis for discussion on public investment for nature as well. The other method that we develop, and this is the work led notably by Alexandre Rambaud, is the CARE model at the business level. So the CARE model has been proposed in the 2010s. It's been the object of several publications. There are a lot of work in France now about this method. I will just here talk about the concept. The concept here is to, again, treat natural capitals, and I say capitals in a plural way because there is a redefinition of what natural capital is as capital entities that need to be preserved. So there are as many capitals as entities that need to be preserved conceptually. And these are treated also as a debt within the accounting system of businesses, so as a liability. So basically, as businesses use nature for their productive processes, they can count how much they, and it's not easy to do so, but we work on that, but they can count how much they degraded in their productive processes, and as they do so, they contract a debt that needs to be repaid and that can be assessed again in terms of costs that can be repaid to reimburse this debt towards the natural capital entities. And so this also provides a method for having a true vision of a company's solvencies in respect to all capitals, including ecological and human capitals, but that's another story. And this, of course, is at the heart of corporate social responsibility and all that. And again, here, what is important to understand is that capitals are valued at their preservation costs that need to be budgeted. They are not valued as future net revenues of ecosystem services or I don't know. It's valued at the costs that need to be paid to put in place the actions that restore nature. So that's the CARE model, and there are ways to integrate it in the balance sheet, in the outcome statement, and in also the management accounting tools. Many studies are currently undertaken for that. And the third layer we're working on, so this is more talking about my own work here, but is what we call ecosystem-centered accounting or ecosystem-centered management accounting, which also has been the object of several publications. But the idea here is to say that the perimeter here is the scale of the actual management of a given ecosystem, a lake, a species, habitat, a forest, and that poses a problem of collective action on the landscape. So it's not the ecosystem as something that is just biophysically defined. It's the ecosystem as a problem to manage among a set of stakeholders that depend or affect this ecosystem. And so here, accounting is to propose accounting architectures as a way to organize collective strategies and collective actions in contexts where action is mostly distributed, responsibilities and accountabilities are difficult to analyze, etc. So accounting is seen here as an answer for that. And what we work on is to define, of course, the good questions about ecological targets and the good ecological status of ecosystems, but also to assess the efforts and costs that are borne by different stakeholders to contribute to it, the different responsibilities that can be attributed to different stakeholders in degrading this ecosystem, and to negotiate different types of contributions provided by diverse set of committed stakeholders in restoring this ecosystem. So there is an accounting model behind that. It's being tested in different fieldworks in France and in Europe, in Italy as well, currently, in pragmatic situations of actions. And so, again, this is work in progress. What I'm trying to say here is that we put forward methods rather than final proposals. We're in the work of developing these methods, and we're presenting it here. But of course, there are lots of empirical work to be done. And to finish in the 1 minute and 30 seconds that are left to me, with the countdown being here, it's very stressful, is the work that we try to undertake to interlink these three methods based on the shared vision that we have that is grounded in strong sustainability. So you can find here the three methods that also correspond to three different perimeters: business, the national, and the multi-stakeholder ecosystem governance. And if you think about the links between these methods, if, for instance, you take the link between national accounting and multi-stakeholder ecosystem governance scale, what a linked ecological accounting architecture can help to do is, for instance, to be able to direct public investment in nature conservation initiatives at the scale of ecosystem management, with a way to then be in a better check whether or not it actually contributes to ecological results in the specific context of the ecosystem management. So that's, for instance, one link. If you take the link between ecosystem-centered accounting and the care model at the business level, it allows for companies to develop strategies at the ecosystem management level, but also to be able to actually assess their liability in relation and relatively to other stakeholders at the ecosystem management level. That would need more development to be clearly understood, but I'm just pointing this out. And the third link between business and national unpaid ecological cost and the care model, for instance, opens perspectives to be able to clarify the extra financial reporting and assessment of accumulated ecological impacts by calculating debts at the level of businesses and then aggregating these debts at the level of sectors, institutional sectors, and then be able to also direct incentives, investments, subsidies, disincentives, etc., to given economic sectors depending on the level of debt that is the one of this specific sector. So these are, of course, perspective of work. We don't have the whole framework for that, but this is the way, the direction that we work toward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Clément, and for having respected the 20 minutes. Congratulations, really, for this. Yeah, I think so. It's very helpful also. I'm now inviting Johanna So Johanna Barasz works on public action, society and participation issues within the society and social policies department at France Stratégie. So for people who do not know France Stratégie is an autonomous institution which is placed directly under the French Prime Minister. So thank you, Johanna. The floor is yours.
Yeah, France Stratégie is kind of the think tank of the government, actually, and deal with long-term studies and perspectives. So thank you for the floor. Thank you for the opportunity to reflect on the result of this report you mentioned, issued by France Stratégie in May 2022, and entitled Sustainabilities, How to Plan and Orchestrate Public Action. This publication is actually the result, the product of a very long and thorough collective work that took place for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, and which implied literally hundreds of contributors and partners, academics, decision makers, think tanks, and so on. So I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share with you today some of the results and recommendations we make in this report. First thing to say, because it frames what I am going to discuss here, is the fact that this work is embedded directly in the aftermath of the yellow vest crisis in France, which underline the depth and the severity of the issues we were facing. But it's also a work that has a lot to do with what we learned during the, obviously during the COVID crisis. So both events having in their own ways deeply challenged the way society and government perceive and deal with systemic and long-term challenges and issues. One word also to say that as much as the work we conducted is really embedded in the French context, we're convinced that the diagnosis it relies on, as well as the core principles of the recommendations we make in it, can be shared by a large number of different countries. Because all of us and a lot of countries have the same urgent need to tackle multiple, vital, interdependent and long-term challenges at once. And here the word "at once" is the most important one. And in most countries, rapid structural and radical reorientations of public actions are required to preserve the planet's livability. And in the meantime, again, the term meantime is the most important. In the meantime, build or safeguard a social model which is currently weakened by demographic and economic changes. And not only in France, this has to be done in a contrast of great mistrust and sometimes shrinking democratic support. So what we try to do in this report is to build a framework for policy development fit to take into account the challenges of the long term and to reconcile the needs of the present and the capacity of future generations to meet their own needs. We felt that the concept of sustainabilities, in French, soutenabilité in the plural form, could help to build such a frame of reference by linking together dimensions that might seem remote at first, environmental and climate issue, of course, but also, and hence the plural, social, economical, territorial, technological, and democratic challenges. So what we called sustainable and sustainable public action is an action that is, in the same time, long-term oriented, systemic, and legitimate. So I won't spend too much time on the diagnosis because, especially in this arena, it is already largely shared. We all know by now that fighting climate change and protecting biodiversity sometimes contradicts the search for equity and social justice. I will just say a quick word on the concept that we use a lot in the report of conflicts of sustainability, which is to say the coexistence of vital and sometimes contradictory objectives that have something to do with limits and exhaustion and cannot be solved only by the comparison or the measurement of prices and costs, and especially not in our current accountability framework that we were just talking about. And we deeply feel that it is this existence of conflicts of sustainability that explains the inertia we experience, and the fact that we react too slowly and too shyly to the long-term challenges we're facing. This inertia, in our view, is largely due to the fact that mobilization of traditional public policy levers, depth, growth, taxes, regulation, and so on, seem in their current form powerless to solve these conflicts. And the main conflicts we really can explain this way. The effects of unsustainable environmental trajectories are already being felt, and they are in turn increasing the population's need for protection and require more and more intervention by the public authorities, which is to say more spending, which is to say more growth, and therefore the consumption of more rarefied resources and the production of more greenhouse gas. So in other words, the very financing of the transition and the protection of the population it needs is based on a development model which sustainability is increasingly uncertain and a source of tension. And the problem is that the search for new models of prosperity and progress that would be more respectful of ecosystems and people, the transformation of in our ways of moving, living, producing, consuming, etc., requires the mobilization of the entire social body, and this has to be achieved, as I said earlier, in a context of undermined adherence and growing democratic mistrust. And this loss of confidence doesn't come from nowhere. Sovereignty, understood both as the power to act and decide of the people and as national independence, is, we know that, in fact, exercised in a complex interplay of interdependencies on a global scale. And this fact pushes the impression that there's very little room for maneuver, no real choices to make, no real places to hear citizen voices, and therefore no real interest in participating in the political and democratic game. And this translates into a very high level of abstention, a crisis of intermediary bodies, and the multiplication of protest, which is the context we have to deal with. And this is very important to keep in mind because the ecological imperative and the narrowness, whether real or perceived, of the possible ways of dealing with it often leads to fears or claims, actually, of the inevitability or of strong measures, or even more, a kind of green dictatorship, which would be unavoidable. And in this context of fear and mistrust, basing a sustainability narrative on the idea that there is no possible alternative, basing the narrative on a China of the climate, referring to the Margaret Thatcher expression, would be probably disastrous and very dangerous. Because if planetary limits are indeed inescapable constraints, the path to decarbonization and to the preservation of the world's livability must remain open in a democratic system. And thus, we have to find new ways to document, to debate, and to choose collectively and govern the transformations needed. So this is first and foremost, and I would like to insist on this, it is a political issue by nature, but it is also a question of method. Steering the long term requires a reflection on the ways and means by which we manufacture public action. The metrics, the models, the frames on which public action is based today does not always make it possible to measure or take into account the imperatives of sustainability, and we've just discussed that. In France, at least, public action is not short of strategies and plans and indicators and green budgeting and so on, but the lack of coherence and overall articulation of these tools between them and between the different sectoral policies leads to inefficiency and a real doubt on the possibility to achieve the long-term goals we give ourselves. And the corollary of this piling of measures and plans and strategies we experience is a risk of dilution of resources and which makes it complex for public actors to act and impossible for citizens to understand and to adopt. So responding to the challenges of sustainability implies finding ways and means of overcoming a tendency to sectorization and short vision, which are detrimental to public action. So for this, we need better tools. We also need to better use existing tools and to better plug these tools into the process of decision-making and public action implementation. And last but not least, we need maybe something a little more than tools sometimes to build a reference framework for long-term oriented, systemic, and legitimate public action. We deeply feel that the construction of such a coherent framework must be enshrined in a shared collective narrative that leave room and space for possible democratic choices inside it. Indeed, as I said, the means to reach the common target can differ according to technological, lifestyles, social choices, and different level of sobriety that are associated with these choices. So by helping to develop visions of the future that are both sustainable and desirable, these narratives could fuel the democratic debate and encourage everyone to take ownership of these issues before making the political choices that would guide public action. So we feel deeply that beyond the day-to-day production of public policies, the consideration of sustainability issues will only be effective if it's based on a shared culture, which goes with training and so on. If we discuss tools, steering the transition also requires to imagine renewed form of planning in order to ensure the achievement of the objectives of sustainability and the convergence of these objectives. The necessity to engage in massive and rapid coordinated efforts provides an obvious purpose for a planning approach that would articulate ecological issues and constraints with the issue and constraints of our other collective preferences, particularly in terms of social and territorial justice. And what we recommend in the report is a renewed form of planning, which could not be a copy of what was done in the second half of the 20th century, obviously. That would be part of a narrative that's able to attract the support of the public and the private actors, citizen and civil society actors. A planning that would be co-constructed with the economic world and civil society in a spirit of commitment and responsibility. A planning, and this would be very different from what we know and experience right now, a planning that would be sufficiently binding to guide the development of sectoral strategies and provide a reference for territorial strategies. Maybe the more important thing, a planning that would aim at making the budgeting and means of action consistent with the targeted objectives. And here we're talking about programming public investment, stimulate private investment, tax modulation, conditionality of public aid, public ordering, state participation in companies with strategic interest, intervention prices, et cetera, et cetera. So what should such a planning be about? In other words, what should we plan? Because this is a question. What does it mean to plan sustainabilities? To us, it seems obvious that such a strategy should be articulated around the decarbonization imperative, which is not only vital, but also benefits in the perspective of planning, also benefits of quantified, dated, and shared horizon at a national as well as an international level. But such a planning shouldn't exclude or prioritize the other environmental and social sustainability objectives. For instance, consumption, production and work, housing, food, education, healthcare, and transportation would be the main themes of such a planning, since they are cross-cutting and interdepartmental by nature. The way to integrate such a planning in the legal and political framework would be very specific to each country, and I won't develop the proposal we make for the French context here. I would just insist on what we consider should be its core principle. Such a planning should be sufficiently binding, it has to be democratically approved and constructed, and it has to be steered from the very center of the government. The democratic ambition of planning supposes the collective definition of precise objectives. Planning means choosing, and choosing for the long term. So this kind of exercise has to be based on a search for an agreement on the definition of priority needs, essential services that justify the allocation of common resources, financial, human, or others. We think that the willingness of private actors, whether individuals or companies, to accept heavy constraints that a global ecological and social transition would imply could be strengthened if the restrictions, prohibitions, standards, or taxes were decided upon a broad and thorough consultative process. Planning can thus be the occasion for a broader reflection on our social construct, leading to a questioning on the priority assigned to our productive system, the strategic choices that lead to autonomy or dependence, the distinction between what can be left to the multiple logic of the market and what deserves to be excluded from it. So really, behind long-term planning lies a fundamental reflection on the ways and means of developing, collecting, and translating collective preferences and the citizen will into policy. Again, the modalities can be diverse to implement such a new form of planning, but I want to insist on the notion of participation. If we want participation and consultation of the public in such an exercise to be able to bring some legitimacy to such a process, there are some conditions that need to be met. And it's very important if we think of the different experiences we have on the field. For instance, la Convention citoyenne pour le climat, which was generally criticized for its outcomes or lack of outcomes, but not for the process itself, which was generally considered as very good and very thoroughly thought. So the question is, again, when we talk about participation, and especially in relationship with planning, is the way to articulate these two ideas and concepts. And for this, there are at least two main conditions. First is the fact that you have to clarify the objective and the outcomes to the public. You have to tell people what you're going to do exactly with the results or of their consultation to avoid deceptions or even deceit. And the second condition, which is linked to this one, is the attention you have to apply to the calendar and the time frame of such a consultations. If important decisions directly linked to what is discussed are taken during the process, then it's useless. And the time needed for the political bodies to adopt and adapt the results of this of the consultations undertaken is also very, very important. So I won't have time to discuss the administrative proposals we do to organize this, but we deeply feel that we need to have a governmental body in charge specifically of this planning, which would have other missions, and this is very important, because traditionally central governments are in charge of planning, advising governments, drawing roadmaps for ministers, and such a body should have all these missions. But we also think that it should be in charge of the culture of sustainability also, with missions around the animation of the public debate, the training of the public agents and the citizens, and the expertise and the foresight which would be needed to implement such a planning. So since France Stratégie issued these recommendations, ecological planification has been embedded in the French institutional framework, actually, through the creation of the Secrétariat Général à la Planification Écologique, the SGPE. And future will show how much this first and very welcome step will contribute, or not, to an effective evolution of our culture and practices and enforce our ability to build a sustainable future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and thank you for your energy. And I really hope that you are still all here and with us, and because we just had two very rich presentations, and we still have one which will be as rich as the others. So I'm inviting Eric. Eric Kemp-Benedict is a senior economist at Stockholm Environment Institute in Somerville, United States. So thank you very much for being here and having traveled so far for having done a so long way. He is director of the Institute's Equitable Transitions Program. So the floor is yours, Eric.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone in the room and also online. And thank you to the organizers for having me and for Stéphanie for facilitating and organizing this. My colleagues and I worked on the Stockholm Plus 50 background technical report, and as we were doing that, we came up with recommendations that were pretty similar to the previous presentation. There's a need for deep structural transformation. But one of the issues that we kept coming up against is the way that prevailing property rights regimes can get in the way of those kinds of transformations. And so this is some preliminary investigation into just why that is and what might change. So I'm going to talk about property rights in economics, which I have some claim to be able to say something about, and then in law, where I at least got a laugh test from some lawyer colleagues, and they said, "Oh, this looks good." So I think it's okay. So in economics, I'm going to contrast two different approaches. And one I'm going to call the market. This is more conventional. And the idea is that you have secure and what are called productive property rights that are then expected, there is faith, that if those are present, then it will lead to what's called the highest and best use for that property, which means maximizing the monetary outcome from it. And so those secure and productive property rights include use, do as you wish, exclusion, keep others out, and alienation, be able to sell, transfer, or encumber it. And I'll say more about encumberment later. And it's underpinned by what are called the fundamental theorems of welfare economics. And I'm first going to give the technical definition. Formal statement is that every Walrasian equilibrium is Pareto efficient, and then you go green. The common interpretation of that could be put this way, once you kind of dig into that, is involuntary markets, so it all has to be voluntary, with a full set of markets at the present time and futures markets for everything, no externalities, where everyone starts with an initial allocation to which they have secure and productive rights, where every market participant seeks his or her own benefit, which is the definition of rationality, and cannot be coerced. Everyone has full information. Market exchange will lead to a Pareto efficient distribution. The second theorem, which is the justification for a policy approach that's called market engineering, turns it around. For any Pareto efficient outcome, there is a corresponding Walrasian equilibrium in the more common interpretation. If the conditions for the first theorem hold, everything I just listed, then any Pareto efficient distribution can be accomplished through a suitable initial allocation followed by market exchange. And just to say what Pareto efficiency is, that means you're in a situation where no one can be made better off by their own criteria without someone else being made worse off. So you're as good as you can get in that sense. A second approach, well, first I'll go over some problems. And there are theoretical, empirical, and normative problems. Theoretical, the common interpretation assumes that there's some process of reaching that equilibrium, but actually the formal proof presumes you're already there and there is no demonstration that you can reach it. And empirically, there are some problems with the amount of information you can collect, and actually, in theory, the proofs that you can get there through a process, they require an implausible amount of information. Empirical property is often insecure, for example, indigenous groups, women, ethnic minorities, other marginalized peoples. And that's a political economy question that you can't just wish away. Definition of rational behavior has almost nothing to do with how actual humans behave. There's literature on that. Future markets are extremely rare for well understood reasons, and they're not going to become more common. And consumers consider the fairness of prices, including social considerations, and they build that into their actions. And normative. Love this from Amartya Sen. Pareto efficiency is not as such a momentous achievement from the point of view of social welfare. A person who starts off ill-endowed may stay poor and deprived even after the transactions, and if that is all that competition offers, the propertyless person may be forgiven for not regarding this achievement as a big deal. And besides, the unique equilibrium is not guaranteed, which means the initial allocation of rights, property rights, matters a lot. And in fact, if you just look at approaches to market engineering, say with water rights, you see, and emissions rights, that you see that these problems come up. That's where all the debates are, is on the initial allocation. And a lot of property actually is burdened. There are certain things you can't do. I cannot make a storefront in my house because I am in a place that is zoned for residential housing, for example. I'm going to take another approach that I'm going to call the economy or economies as systems view. And this is not that uncommon. It's not the dominant view, but there are a lot of people working in this area. And I would say this is the underlying approach with the GEM model, for example. And I'm going to present one part of this, the monetary circuit. Economic activity takes time. This is part of the argument with the monetary circuit theory. And it is made possible by credit, since you have to start with some money in order to invest. How do you get that? If you haven't made any money yet, because it takes time, you get credit. And I'm going to mention the work of two economists, Heinsohn and Steiger, with their property economics. And they say, okay, something that a lot of people recognize, if you're going to borrow, you can get a better deal if you can post property as collateral. And if you have no collateral, it's extraordinarily hard to get any property, any loans. And so that is a type of burden called hypothecation. You still keep your right of use, you keep the right of exclusion, but you have lost the right of alienation because you've just burdened it. But what they also point out is that lenders do the same thing. They restrict the further use of their property that underwrites the loan once they make the loan. And so they say actually both sides of this are constrained. And what they say is that implies that the scale of economic activity is constrained, although not absolutely limited, by the market valuation of property. Now, I just want to say a point about nature as property. If you go for, it's missing one bit. If you go for highest and best use, basically this is what happens when you go for highest and best use of property. You start with a robust ecosystem that has a lot of different outputs. A few of them might be something you could sell. Others might be things you value but you're not selling. And then a lot might actually be things you don't want from a human perspective, but they make for a robust ecosystem. And so you maximize the bit that you can sell. This is highest and best use to the detriment of those other roles. Property rights in law, starting with Western law, a traditional view, there's this idea of things versus people, and I'll just introduce the terminology. Things are called in rem, and persons in personam from the Latin. And I just want to be very clear, persons are not equal to human beings in law. Historically, the enslaved people, women, non-citizens were not considered persons, and corporations are considered today as legal persons, for example. And so then you have a question of rights in personam versus rights in rem. So rights in personam or rights vis-a-vis one or a limited number of specific other persons. Rights in rem, you're still talking about people. You're talking about things, but law is about relationships between people. So rights in rem are, by virtue of owning a thing, that's why it's in rem, their rights hold against anyone in the world. So what do I mean? Okay. You go and you see a sign, private property. You don't have to spell out what that means. You can't go onto that land if you have a sign that says private property. That's not 100%. In the UK, for example, you have right to roam across some historically accessible paths. But basically, having those rights that hold against anyone in the world lets you, it simplifies the way that you specify. There's been this approach, this bundles of rights approach that has been criticized in that they are it doesn't take that rights in rem idea with properly into account. And so I'm going to mention these names too, Bell and Parchamovsky. They tried to synthesize a lot of insight into property law, in Western law, and they argued that property law as a legal institution is organized around creating and defending the value inherent in stable ownership. And then they had an idea for when that could be seen as in rem, when the taking of a thing would deprive you of that value. And so I'm going to combine these two. Bell and Parchamovsky meet Heinsohn and Steiger. Property law creates and defends the value inherent in stable ownership, which provides the means for a monetary economy to operate and at least partially determines its scale. So this is the starting point. This is how I want to think about property rights in economics here. And a corollary is that in rem property burdens will broadly constrain economic activity. And if they also limit harms to partially or fully irreplaceable ecosystem functions, then they can make a positive contribution towards strong sustainability. Okay, so that's kind of my framing. I'm working ultimately in analysis within a Western context. So this is, but I want to learn from non-Western property rights systems. So I'll turn to that for a moment. Legal anthropologists have looked at what might be called property around the world, and they say you have to identify social units that can have those property relationships, units of the natural and social environment that can be the object of those, and the rights, duties, privileges, and possibilities of property holders. Examples from South Africa, I'll read this quote: "The content of existing indigenous law land rights is very difficult to articulate in language. There simply are no terms for a wife's claim to an agricultural plot. Rather, that a wife is expected to raise crops for the family seems to rest on the premise that she must have access to an agricultural plot." So it actually comes down to a duty towards her family. Northeast Canada. Ownership, according to the Cree, involves keeping traditional law and order in that area, ensuring that the land is not abused, and overseeing the sharing of resources. As the Cree point out, the beaver or goose boss is really given not the animals, but the responsibility for distributing the wealth of the land. And so I would note in saying this that ecosystems are often better protected when they are under indigenous management. This is from the IPBES report, 2019 IPBES report. So there are two possibilities, and both have been followed: to transfer land to indigenous peoples, something I would fully support, and two, to learn from indigenous rights systems to improve the sustainability in land where under systems that are not under indigenous management. And one way to learn from indigenous rights systems has been in this movement for rights of nature. There's a big push to assign rights of nature, which means, under a Western law system, that means assigning personhood to nature. And in practice, some human or institution must have standing to bring claims on behalf of nature. This actually has been done successfully in some jurisdictions. But I'm going to propose something that is a little bit different, because what I saw in my reading of indigenous rights systems is that there's a big focus on duties. And in fact, there have been some criticisms that rights of nature doesn't really take into account that duty aspect of those systems. And I would suggest that by virtue of having control over something, in-rim duties would impose on the owner duties with respect to everyone else in the world. So that's the parallel. And that sounds pretty vague. For example, you might have to preserve biodiversity. So I gave that example of that sign right there of a community garden near where I live, where people are just kind of begging people to contact the city and say, please preserve this. This is an organic garden that is pollinator friendly. And this would, if there were duties, a duty of preserving biodiversity, the presumption would be that they would have to preserve it. And there is a precedent. There's a very vague idea of duty of care that is an impersonal duty you owe to everyone. And in fact, you can come and say you did not exercise your duty of care. You have left a rake on the sidewalk and I stepped on it and it hit me. And so enacting duties in RIM towards ecosystem-based property would create broad-based burdens that would limit harms to partially or fully irreplaceable ecosystem functions. So this is where I'm getting back to, and then that would also constrain some economic activity. And that's really all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Clément and Johanna. So we still have 25 minutes for discussions, which is really great. Thank you for having respected the time. And so I propose to give the floor to the room. There is one of my colleagues in the room, Annabelle Moro Santos, who will relay the questions from the chat. So thank you very much from her. And so please do not hesitate to give your questions. Be as short as possible so that we will have time to give answers. I'm speaking, that's why you cannot speak for the moment. Oh. Okay, great. So if someone wants to ask a question, yes, please.
Thank you. Very interesting session so far. This question is primarily for Clément. I should say, Andy Seidel, Colorado State University, and BioFin, UNDP BioFin, which is disclosure. AFD is a donor. So there we go. So within BioFin, we've been trying to tackle some of the similar issues where we're looking at financial accounting as opposed to economic accounting that SEA and some of the others are using. And among the things that we're feeling challenged by in order to ensure comparability across countries or across institutional units and potentially a derivation of costing coefficients, how to go about categorization of budget lines as ecology and biodiversity do not have a budget line. So many things would be considered not 100% in the service of biodiversity. So how do we go about doing that in a systematic manner? And then further, how are you dealing with expenditures that are unintentionally or intentionally negative for biodiversity? It's more of a standard accounting question.
I propose that we take 2 or 3 questions and...
Someone else?
Thank you. It's a more general question for the audience in the room. Well, the presenters. So I want to just go back to the original title, which was about the planification. I mean, my understanding is that the ecological transition is really about restructuring the economies, and I think this has been clearly laid out in the presentation. But this restructuring is actually about changing the productive structure, but also how we value things and how institutions govern the way in which we have relations. And I think this shows that the 3 speakers were actually contributing to the same initial thinking. But the problem is that we are in a deeply interconnected and constrained system, and so we have to make sure that the 3 responses here about changing the way in we produce, changing the way we value things, and changing the way in which we govern things are addressed at the same time. And what I see, however, is that most of the response we have are easy targets, where we say we are going to have an emergence of a champion. Right? Carbon pricing will shift the way in which we value things, so it will be the answer. Or public investment and regulation will be changing the way we produce things or the way we govern things. And so I mean, I guess my question is, how do you make sure that the true planification or restructuring emerges, while at the same time we have to change everything together, right? So it begs the question of having this common narrative emerging in an extremely fast way, because we don't have too much time, and with high ambition. So I would, sorry, it is a very generic question, but I would really like having your feedbacks on this.
Okay, it's a very large question, so maybe we can start answering. Who wants to start? Maybe Clément?
So maybe I should have said something by starting to speak, which I'm not a real accountant. I come from environmental management in the first place, and I went towards accounting as a way, and in order to find methods to tackle that. That's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer is that I'm mostly working on the ecosystem-centered accounting method that I developed. So my answers will be less precise than if Alexandre Rambaud on the business, the care model would have answered. But I'll try my best saying that. So the first thing is, your first question was about how to systematize, how to standardize in some ways. That's how I understood it. The way we count both expenditures, negative or positives, and what is biodiversity degradation or not. Is that a right understanding of your question? So the way we approach it in the care model and the ecosystem-centered accounting framework is that the idea is, and that will make a link to the third question that was asked. The idea is not to say that we must start with a priori definitions of what a good expenditure or a bad expenditure is, or a priori definition of a definitive definition of what good status is, etc. But for each ecological entity that needs to be preserved, there is a work to be done by the business, for instance, or by the organization, to actually reflect on what is this capital entity to be preserved. How do we define it? What is the specific context of its use? What is the specific context of the activities that I implement that degrade this capital entity, etc., etc. So there is this contextualized approach to what natural capitals are, saying that you can start from the definitions of good ecological status that are either already the object of norms and regulations, so that they are already the object of a collective agreement on what needs to be reached in terms of good ecological status of a river or of a forest, etc. So that's a starting point. That's one of the main starting points. And then when you turn to the costs and the expenditures, it would require getting more into the machinery of the care model. But the idea is that as you degrade, as you degrade these entities, you can actually the cost that you produce is actually the cost of the actions that you need to implement to restore it. So you need to have a reflection on what kinds of actions you need to put in place in order to put back the ecosystem or the natural capitals at the level before you degraded it in some ways. And this it's a long answer. So this kind of gives you the cost. So that's a way to get out of it. So that's a kind of answer. And just for the third question that was asked, I was actually happily surprised with the convergences between the three talks, between the idea of nature in some ways as a duty. So as a liability, so as a debt in some ways, so as something to be accountable for. That's the first convergence. And also in ecological planning, the need to have tools that not only gives you measures, rational measures, but actually tools for dialogue, discussion, democratic appropriation and representation of the problems, etc., which also in my mind brings back to accounting. So, but regarding your question, I would say that I totally get it that a shared narrative is something that is paramount, but another part of me thinks that if we put too much pressure on first having a shared narrative and then acting, then it's going to be difficult. And the reason why I have some sort of belief in the accounting work that we're doing is because it's processual. It's a method to discuss things as they go and as we try to organize them in the real crafty world that we inhabit as imperfect, non-rational humans. That's what accounting is about. And saying that, the question is to reduce potentially the pressure on first having this shared narrative, but more saying, okay, let's try to recompose narratives in the many spaces that we inhabit in our daily lives. And maybe at some point a shared narrative will emerge, but let's start with some methods to try to make these narratives emerge. So that would be my take on that. And on the question, that's my last point, on the question of the carbon price, as you might have understood, the methods that we develop in the Ecological Accounting chair are completely different from this kind of idea. This idea that you can find finally le Graal, the method, the price, the metric that will make everything commensurable is something that is opposite to what I've just developed.
Maybe very large question indeed, and very difficult to answer. But maybe I'd like to bounce on two aspects of the question and reflect on what you've just said about narratives. I think there are two main ideas behind your question. One is the question of time, which is essential and probably even more complex than it was said. Because one of the main difficulty we have to face is the articulation of very, very different essential timings, and the short timing of public and political government, which is not only, as often said, due to the incapacity of politicians to see the future or to have long-term interest. It's a very structural problem, because we are dealing and discussing radical and very important changes in our very way of living and interacting, and so it has to reflect on collective preferences and citizen decisions, and this is done in a short timing frame that lasts 5 years at most. And we cannot democratically engage the whole population on issues that will last for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But the issues we are confronted have this kind of time framing, and the climate issue, but also demographic issues are very long-term issues. So we really have to set up a new way of political thinking that sets a very long-term frame in which there's room for the chain of impulsion in the very democratic fabric of things. And for instance, for planning, if we try to be a little operational, what we suggested in the report we've made is to have a legal framing like the LOLF, like the budgeting frame we have, which would last longer by definition than a political mandate, and the planning inside this framing would last for the 5 years of a mandate, and then will reflect on political orientations on middle terms issues, but this is very, very complicated, and it's again democratically it's all the most complicated that there's no social body or political body that is legitimate to be the future or future generations or talk for future generations. So this is a very important question. And as to the question of narrative, again there's an articulation to timing articulation to imagine, and I would really like to insist on this idea that what should be common is the conscious of the limits and what cannot be done, and this has to be drawn quickly because the urgency of the issues we're facing in the climate issue as well as the biodiversity one, and this has to be priority and again very quick, because if not we're going into the wall. So but inside this, and I insist on this, there are different paths and different narratives, and each of these narrative, and this is also something very important to underline, they are driven by ideological and visions of the world that must be discussed as such. These are not technical issues. It was very interesting in the scenarios that were drawn by the ADEME, for instance, about the different paths, the different scenarios path on decarbonization, that they took time to reflect on this ideological question and assess the fact that more or less sobriety, more or less technological investments is not only a technical arbitration, it's really a political and should be the democratical choices that have to be made together.
Thank you. I'll start with the second question and then say a little bit about the first. So on the second question, first, I completely agree with the previous two speakers, and then I'm going to say the slice of that question that I've been focusing on, which is how can you set up institutions that will help individuals just in the course of their lives make choices that will be conducive to sustainability. And the idea behind, the property rights in conventional economic thinking is if you have the right property rights, you can trust people to pursue their self-interest, and it will maximize wealth. Unfortunately, that destroys the environment. So the question is, can you have something similar? And the work of Elinor Ostrom is excellent on this, on common pool resources. I would say in actual applications, the challenge that I see is when you're managing common pool resources, it really works well when all of the uses those resources are being put to are mutually comprehensible to the people using the system. Fisheries, irrigation schemes, and so on. When you have very different, radically different uses, that's where people say, well, you need a market. If you're going to have somebody use water in a very different way, you need a market. The only way you can do it is by pricing. I'm like, well, But so the question is, can you set up institutions so that people making individual choices about those resources can do it in a more sustainable way? And I think the price suggestion is not sufficient because price is not it acts on the margin. It's extremely hard to identify the appropriate price. It's very incomplete. Really doesn't help with structural change and so on. And so that's why I started looking at law. And I would say I learned, thank you very much, Stéphanie, about a paper with a colleague of Ostrom's on addressing through the law how to deal with common pool resources. So there's a nice complementarity that I'm looking forward to exploring. Regarding the first question, I would say that if you try to account for everything in ways that require some fictional prices, so ones that that aren't actually expressed, then it can be very difficult for those to influence people's behavior unless you institutionalize that response. To say you have to take this into account and so on. And so the approaches that Clément was talking about, for example, help to do that. There is another approach that was in the plenary, I just want to mention, that you impose constraints. So you have your accounting in terms of actual money exchanging hands, and then you impose constraints. If you need to get the associated value for whatever reason, reporting reasons and so on, you can use a shadow price approach. But you can also simply impose the constraint. And the example from climate is exactly as Antonin was saying, is you don't try to cost out climate. You say, we have a target, we have a policy target. Now, how do we do it? How much is that going to cost? And you don't go back and question the target. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What I suggest is that we take some questions from people who are online. And so, Annabelle, if you can relay some questions, please.
Yes, we have actually two questions. One from Conrado Márquez Rosano. And this question goes for Clément mostly. So the question is, although ecological accounting provides information to make better decisions and to enlighten decision makers, so don't you think that ecological accounting system should also be linked to construction of new institutions and political agreements? Then I just switched to the second one from Sarah Paquet. And this one is rather related to Johanna's presentation. She's asking or saying, would not the treatment of the local scale be more relevant than globalize at the national or even international scale? And she also notes that the solution you mentioned seem to be based on constraints, meaning tax, subsidies, etc. And she was asking or wondering if there were other solutions potentially. Thank you.
Okay, we still have only 4 minutes, and I maybe have one additional question for you. No, Eric, you don't want an additional question. we can talk during the coffee break. It's up to you. Well, just to complete, I would like to know if your proposal based on duties would limit or not opportunities for development in low and middle-income countries. So it's a big question too. So we still have just 3 minutes because after we have a very interesting plenary session and
be very short.
Start at time.
Thank you very much for this question. This is an excellent question because that's actually something I wanted to say by listening to my colleague, which is accounting is an institution, and it is an institutionalizing process because it is based on human conventions that are being decided, that are being debated, that can be discussed and rediscussed and reevaluated. So I totally agree. At the three levels that I spoke about, the question of the institution will be dealt with differently, of course. It is much more visible with the national perimeter, which the state being a set of institutions, so that's the easy one. At the business perimeter, the question is, how do you institute different forms of governance of businesses where natural capital's representatives have their words in the governing bodies of the business? And at the ecosystem level, this is exactly the meaning of ecosystem-centered accounting, is to actually be a kind of institution or coordination dispositive or strategic dispositive, and at the end an institution in the absence of an institution of ecosystem governance. So thank you very much for this question. It's really to the point.
So very quickly on the local issue, yes, of course. The France Stratégie is a national body, so we had and adopted a national point of view. And more important, we are convinced that what we're talking about is also a question of sovereignty, and in a very large sense of the term, and the national level remains the place where legitimacy and national narratives are built. So it is a very important level, but our next work and studies that are actually on the rails are about local competencies and planning in the matter, because in France, as well as a lot of other countries, the actual powers and competency rely on local bodies on these issues and environmental issues specifically, and also social. On the constraint, it's not the only way, but we are also convinced that incitement is not the only is not enough faced to the gravity and severity of the rapidity of the change we have to make, and the institution of a new set of regulations and law and culture, which is not directly abiding, is essential today.
And it's red, but I can do this. So thank you for the question. I would say it is a risk, but what it points to is the need for legal reforms to be contextually specific. You can't actually simply transfer one legal system to another. I'm also going to point to a problem in the other direction, which is ecosystem services valuation shows there's a lot of value in developing countries. However, it is not actual money, so you can't post it for collateral. So what happens is high-income actors come in and say, we can realize this value, and that is part of what's behind these large-scale land conversion schemes. So, yeah.
Hey. Thank you. 2 seconds, so I have to close the session very rapidly. Thank you so much, everyone. Bravo. Congratulations. So no coffee break for the moment. We go directly. No.
No coffee break, and now we go directly to the next plenary session on post-development.
Okay, so you can stay here.